Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So on May 10th, I was informed that Fantasy Grounds it was no longer going to be selling Volo's Guide to Monsters or Mordenkaine's Tome of Foes on their platform. So here's the post. And what happened is basically a member of my Discord brought this to my attention, and we started to speculate on what this meant. And we kind of figured that, we couldn't see why Fantasy Grounds would stop selling these titles unless they were told to stop selling them. So then, yeah, lo and behold, the next day, I discovered this FAQ on D&D Beyond, Monsters of the Multiverse D&D Beyond FAQ. And basically, they say here, what I'm not going to do is just read this out to you. I just want to actually tell you what it says, I think it means for the game, and talk about the content on this channel and how this is going to affect that content. So, first off, it seems like Monsters of the Multiverse and Volo's Guide to Monsters is going to stop being sold on May 17th. Now, Monsters of the Multiverse is going to be for sale on May 16th, so the timing here shouldn't be a shock to anybody. Basically, Wizards of the Coast is bringing Monsters of the Multiverse in. And now, I mentioned when I did the review of the racial selections in Monsters of the Multiverse, I talked about some of the writing they had in there that really suggested to me that this was intended to be a replacement for that original content. So this wasn't intended to be racial variants and monster variants. These were intended as updated versions, but they're not errata. So that old information still exists. It's like when 3.5 came out, it wasn't errata for 3rd edition. If you wanted to continue playing 3rd edition and you wanted to continue using 3rd edition content, you were welcome to do so. You own that material, you bought it, you could still use it. That is the case here. So with Monsters of the Multiverse, if you buy it, you're going to have access to it. But if you already bought Volo's Guide to Monsters and Mordenkaine's Tome of Foes, no one is keeping you from using that content. And I want to mention here that they are very specific that if you've bought that content on D&D Beyond or on Roll20 or on Fantasy Grounds or any other platform, they're not taking it away from you. You will still be able to use it just as you were able to do so before. However, new players are not going to be able to purchase that content anymore. So you'll still own it, but new players will not own it. They'll be able to buy it if they buy it secondhand, like a physical copy. But if they want online versions or the online content through D&D Beyond or Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or whatever, they will not be able to purchase it that way as of May 17th. And there was some debate online whether Wizards of the Coast intended Monsters of the Multiverse to be like variants. Clearly, that is not the case. These are updated versions, and their intention is that these are going to be replacements. And again, they're not saying that you have to use them, but from their standpoint, these are the new races. So how is this going to affect the game? Well, first off, I think they're going to get their way. So if you are one of the people who says you don't like Monsters of the Multiverse, you don't like the races that were presented there, you don't like the monsters that were presented there, and you're not going to use them, you're welcome to do so. But just be aware, you're not the first to do so. People who played 1st edition said they weren't going to switch to 2nd. Some of the people who played 2nd said they weren't going to switch to 3rd. People who were playing 3rd said they weren't going to switch to 3.5. People who were playing 3.5 weren't going to switch to 4th. People who were playing 4th weren't going to switch to 5th. And a lot of those players are still playing those editions, and they're welcome to do so. They own that content. However, Wizards doesn't support that content anymore, and they're not going to support Volo's Guide to Monsters, and they're not going to be supporting Mordenkaine's Tome of Foes. We're moving towards an updated Player's Handbook in 2024, and Monsters of the Multiverse is clearly intended to be a companion to that. So basically, they're releasing what will essentially be Edition 5.5, and they're doing it in stages. And Monsters of the Multiverse is one of those stages, and the Player's Handbook will be the big one, and that'll be in 2024. And at that time, if you want to still use your initial 5th edition Player's Handbook, again, you will be welcome to do so. However, what you're going to find is that players who come to D&D are not going to be able to access that content or buy that content online, so they're going to use the available content. And essentially, the percentage of players that are using the old content is going to decline. It's going to constantly decline until they're niche groups. And if you look hard enough, you're going to find groups that still use Mordenkaine's Tome of Foes and Volo's Guide to Monsters in the old 5th edition handbook, even after 2024. But you're going to have to look harder and harder for those groups, or continue playing in your existing groups where everyone around the table wants to continue using that content. Now, one thing I will mention here is that they do say that if you own Volo's Guide to Monsters and or Mordenkaine's Tome of Foes on D&D Beyond, and you are at the master subscriber level, currently you can create a campaign and you can invite players and then they can access your content. That also is not being taken away. So if you are a DM and you have those books and you want to run your campaign with those books, and some of your players might be newer and have been unable to access those books because they didn't own them as of May 17th, you can share that content with them and they'll be able to access it at your table. However, if you are playing at a table that maybe the players, most of them have come after May 17th, in addition, maybe the DM has, well, you may have to just get used to that some new tables you're going to be having to use Monsters of the Multiverse. It's just the way it is, because that old content isn't going to be available anymore unless they purchase physical copies secondhand. So that's how I think it's going to affect the game. I think it's going to be just like a 3.5. Basically, you don't have to use it. No one's going to force you to use it. However, if you're committed to continuing to use that content and not the new content, it will be harder for you to find groups in the future. As for the content on this channel, I'll be switching to Monsters of the Multiverse for my character builds because that will be the current content. Clearly, Wizards of the Coast intends it as a replacement, and when new players might come to my channel, I want them to be able to use and access the mechanics that I provide in my builds. So when you see builds on this channel starting next week, I will not be using Volo's Guide to Monsters or Mordenkaine's Tome of Foes for those builds anymore, because I just don't think it's relevant to newer players. However, if you watch this channel, you'll also know that most of my builds don't involve those races anyways. Most of my builds use variant humans or custom lineage or halflings, and those haven't changed, so I'll still be using them. And I've been using the new Dragonborn from Fizbins. They're not changing, so again, most of my builds aren't really going to be affected by this. But I will be interested in looking at build options with some of these new races or the new versions of these races. So you'll probably see some builds for them in the near future. Now, as for what happens to your existing content and new content on D&D Beyond, they said they're going to be using some kind of tags so you can easily differentiate between the older content and the new content. If you have existing characters that use, say, the old kobold, they'll still be there and they will not be modified just because you bought Monsters of the Multiverse. It'll still have the same mechanics it used to have, though the option is going to be there for you to update those races on your characters if that's what you want to do. In addition, if you're building a new character, you're going to be able to still access that old content for your racial selections, just like you are now. And again, they said somehow they're going to clarify. We kind of see that already. If you use D&D Beyond, you'll see that there's certain races that are listed multiple times, and it kind of talks about what the source is for those races, because there are mechanical changes between them. Now, what are my feelings on this? Am I upset? I've heard a lot of people are really upset with Wizards of the Coast for making this change. I'm not upset with them. I think the company has every right to stop selling old products and start selling new products. Now, if they started restricting our access to that content we had already purchased, then I'd be really pissed off. That would be really unfair and I think unethical, but they're not doing that. They're saying that if you bought it already, it's fine. You can keep it, you can still use it, and we won't remove any of your ability to access it. However, we're moving on. And if you want to keep up with new players, you're going to need to move on too. And that's just the way it is. That's not new. This didn't start in 2022. This started with 2nd edition D&D. But the final thing I want to mention is, if you have decided that you don't want to use Monsters of the Multiverse and the people you play with are not going to be using it, I would suggest that if you want to use Volo's Guide to Monsters and Mordenkaine's Tome of Foes and you don't already own that content, you might want to look at purchasing it within the next few days. Otherwise, you're looking at secondhand, and if you are using a digital platform, you're basically going to be SOL. So that's all I really had to say on this topic. And I just want to apologize for my lighting. I'm in the process of getting ready to move. And I recently had a flood and lost some of my lighting equipment. So if my lighting looks particularly bad today, I know it never looks great, but if it looks particularly bad today, that's why. So thanks everyone. I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because it's pretty relevant news and it did affect this channel. And I wanted to keep you informed on what you could expect in the future. So until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.